Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Thomas's Reading Room. We're doing Trip Across the Pond, getting through the chapters, and today we'll be doing Chapter 12, Battle of LZ Gold. Now this is a really good, listening good, this chapter. You guys have been waiting a long time. Now you're going to start getting into the meat of things here in Vietnam. I want to remind you, this book wasn't written to give you blood, guts, and glory. You got that from Hollywood. You didn't need that, and that wasn't the purpose of this book. Thomas Chptr again wrote this book because he wanted to bridge the gap between the people and the Vietnam veteran, which the people were lied to by the United States government, and they took it out on the Vietnam veteran. And then the news media helped tremendously. They contributed to calling the veteran baby killers and all this propaganda crap. So when the Vietnam veteran come home, people hated him. So not too good. But that's not the way it is today, because eventually a little bit of the truth came out. Let's get on with the chapter today. The Battle of LZ Gold. At battalion headquarters, I learned how our soldiers were doing. They were engaged in an Operation Junction City, the largest operation thus far. 3 Eagle flights had airlift our battalion plus the 2nd 77th Armor into a clearing near an abandoned village called Suoi Tre to establish a fire support base camp. 1,000 meters from Suoi Tre was another fire support base camp called Suoi Dau. It was being protected by the 2nd Battalion, 22nd Mechanized Infantry. There had been a few skirmishes with the NVA and an NVC regiment in the past, and we wanted to get something going with them. The idea to set up a fire support base camp surrounded by one company of infantrymen was in hopes that it would lure the enemy to come out of hiding and attack. The infantry and artillery were mainly being used as bait. Whenever soldiers went out on an operation and could not be reached by the artillery back at base camp, a fire support base camp would have to be set up within firing range of that operation. It would consist of 105 millimeter howitzers and was usually protected by an infantry company of approximately 125 soldiers. The company of soldiers would establish a circular perimeter around the fire support base camp. The remaining companies, usually 2, would be somewhere off in the distance, searching for the enemy. When the first of the 3 Eagle flights arrived at scheduled LZ Gold, the first 3 Hueys were disintegrated by a 250-pound bomb. It was dropped at an earlier time by the Air Force and had not gone off. A dud. The enemy had carefully placed their detonator to the bomb and waited until we arrived. Hueys did not land, per se. They would get close enough to the ground for the soldiers to bail out, then the pilots would get the hell out of the area. The shit hit the fan, and we had fought desperately to control the situation. Later, the enemy pulled back. We got the fire support base camp set up, and the few 105 millimeter howitzers were airlifted in by Chinook. Bravo Company got the honors of pulling perimeter around the fire support base camp at Alpha, and Charlie Company went off into the distance searching for the enemy in an area where there was no enemy. Although things had been quiet, there was suspicion of some activity on the other side of the Suoi River. One evening, an officer of one platoon sent 12 soldiers in a 4-man boat across the Suoi River. The boat sank and 4 soldiers drowned. One soldier, a specialist 4th class who was in that boat, was ordered later to swim across the river. It was not certain if he did or not. One night, the silence was unbearable. Then early in the morning, all hell broke loose. Enemy soldiers were everywhere. Some were tied to trees by chain so as they could not get away. What the hell? They knew they were going to be killed by us, and if they did not fight, they would be killed by their own. The artillery was shooting the 105 millimeter howitzers point blank at the enemy. However, the enemy kept coming. They came wave after wave. They were so fucked up, it was unbelievable. The enemy was drugged to the maximum, and it was difficult to conceive how they could be effective. Heroin, opium, you name it. The enemy would have to look in their wallets to find out what their name was, and perhaps then they still might not know. Bravo Company attempted to give the enemy everything they had, though there must have been at least 2,500 of them. They got closer, and the artillery soldiers began to fire beehives at them, point blank. Each container of beehives held more than 8,000 flechettes. The enemy was laying in trees all over the place. Still more of them kept coming. One platoon was completely overrun, and the last command given by the commanding officer was, "Every man for himself." Remember the soldier that was in the boat mentioned earlier, who may have swam that river? He was also in that platoon. Everyone was dead except that one soldier, and his survival had depended on how well he could act like he was dead. He had been wounded, and to make things even more difficult, 3 enemies laid down beside him and fired their rifles off his left arm. After the 3 enemies quit firing, they got up and went through the soldier's pockets, then hightailed it. Later, back at camp, that soldier was given a silver star, Purple Heart, and a pat on the back. His life? Well, you could put it up for sale and you would not be able to get a green and yellow cent for it. Having the privilege to meet and share experiences with that soldier afterward gave me another another increment of understanding as to man's thought process. He was a big person, and I always thought that he could hurt someone just playing with them. Inside, he was without question a true spirit. He could have my seat at any time. The worst thing I could think of is if he had to ask me. The enemy finally got to the perimeter of the fire support base camp and was first fast approaching the 105 millimeters when, like the cavalry on TV, the 2nd Mechanized Infantry came on the scene with their tank guns blazing. They had managed to plow their way through some 1,000 meters of thick vegetation and miraculously crossed the Suoi River. In no time, it seemed the enemy was crawling over the tanks like ants around the top of a jar full of honey. With their knives out, the enemy savagely stabbed at the tanks. The men in their tanks were shooting at each other's tanks to kill the enemy. Should there be such a thing as lunacy? It was clearly exhibited there at Suoi Tre. I was told that with the help from the Air Force supporting the artillery, the enemy had begun to withdraw. During the conflict, it was said that some of our soldiers held up one of their legs, hoping to get themselves shot so they could be taken out of the field. One soldier crawled out of a foxhole to take a shit and was shot in the chest. The first sergeant and another sergeant were sharing a foxhole. They were inebriated to a degree. The first sergeant asked the other sergeant, "If I cover you, do you think that you can get that case of beer in the foxhole next to us?" "Hell yes," the sergeant replied. The first sergeant began a wail of fire as the other sergeant crawled over to the foxhole and retrieved the case of beer without a scratch. From the enemy, that is. The first sergeant and the other sergeant continued to live in harmony. Now that case of beer was something worth fighting for. A couple of newsmen were shooting film as the battle was taking place. Afterward, they sent the film back to the United States to show the United States citizens. The battle lasted 6 days. Now, the mopping up exercises were being conducted, and some soldiers had to go around and collect the dead bodies. A recovery tank was used to make a trench. The trench was long, wide, and deep enough to conceal the recovery tank. 647 enemy bodies were collected and placed in the trench. Despite the surviving enemy's attempt to stop the mass burial by shooting and destroying one tract on the recovery tank, the mass burial was achieved. It would be a conservative guess that more than 200 KIAs killed in action and WIAs wounded in actions were carried away by their fellow comrades. Our soldiers, we lost to the best of my knowledge 87 men. How many were mentally wounded? I have not an idea. Perhaps everyone that was there. Among the enemy dead we found a man, Caucasian, that may have been a Russian, and a Negro who we were sure was French. Apparently they were advisors who are trained to advise the enemy when and where to attack. They were much like the Green Beret and other special forces of the United States. Our soldiers definitely needed a break after the largest battle in Vietnam had been fought up to that time. They were high-strung, and rightfully so. It seemed more than sad our soldiers had to go through something like that. However, war is war, and perhaps it was a clear picture of man in his totality. There came the thought, should man not keep creating things like wars, then he may no longer be able to sustain himself and perish. Without a doubt, our soldiers came back to camp much different from when they left. Most of them realized they would not be the same ever again. They said little and were very quiet. It had been one hell of an experience for them, and there would be more to come as their time in Vietnam had not yet been served. A couple of weeks later, the film of the battle was sent to our battalion from the news agency in the United States, and the officers, a few sergeants, got to watch the battle on film. Being the driver for Battalion Major Erwin Pulsifer, I got to see the film also. Later, the 4th Division was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for its action. Letter. Dear Dad and Mom, another letter today. Be glad when the day I go home. This place gets to you after a while. Of course, I have about 138 days left, so I guess that's not too long. Not really too much to say. Everything is going okay here, and not much time to think. But when I do, I guess it's about going back to the States. So the river is going over the banks. Probably when you receive this letter, the water will have gone down. Have you taken my car up to have it fixed yet? You have to take a picture of my car when it's finished, so I can see what the finished results are. Remember, no painting done, just primed. That's all. Then when I get home, I'll see about getting it painted. In fact, why don't you send some pictures of yourself and Mom and other things around the place so I can see how the American people are living. I'm still working on sending that box home with the picture. Well, that's about wraps it up for now. We'll write later. So be good and careful, and if not good, at least careful of Tom. Ford is a pretty nice car. It's been so long since I drove one. Thank you, folks, and look forward next to us for Chapter 13, Become More Acquainted with the 4th Division, and that the Battle of Elzey Gold was the largest battle that was fought up to that time, and that was 647 confirmed, and they did pull bodies away. So I apologize for getting choked up a little bit. We'll see you next time. Ciao.